issue. One is that our own heroic staff every day are under a barrage of abuse on social media when we have the temerity to argue for slightly lower taxes or, outrageous, we don't think HS2 is the best use of money. Apparently that's beyond the pale and, we ought to be cancelled and all these kinds of things. So, in honour of our heroic staff, we thought we ought to tackle this issue. And the second is that those who engage in things, cancel culture and this kind of thing, quite often they're funded by taxpayers. There's a whole blob out there of charities and campaign groups that are in receipt of significant amounts of taxpayers' money, and that is, of course, a concern to a group that wishes to cut waste. So with that in mind, we'll get going because we've only got an hour and we've got 4 excellent speakers. I'll introduce as I hand over to them to save the long, boring intro bit. So I'll go straight to Michael Prescott, who is the Managing Director at Hanover Communications and the former political editor of the Sunday Times. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, John, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for turning up tonight. So, I detest what you say, but I defend to the death your right to say it. Voltaire. Actually misattributed. It was a Victorian biographer of Voltaire who summarized his thoughts so succinctly. It's a lovely one-liner. I suspect everyone in this tent tonight agrees with that statement. But the problem is that, like all neat summaries, it leapfrogs just a little bit too easily over the difficulties that you encounter when you allow free speech. I'm going to try and cover 3 things very briefly. Firstly, the principle of free speech as laid out by the likes of Voltaire and John Stuart Mill. I'm going to say a word about the attack that free speech finds itself under in our universities and indeed other universities in the Western world. And likely, I want to, lastly, picking up actually what you were saying, John, I want to say a thing or two about free speech on social media. So, principle of free speech. You know what? It's hugely important for democracy. Democracy is the only system of government that does not infantilize its citizens. It treats them as grown-ups. It takes as axiomatic that citizens are capable of listening to or mounting argument and counter-argument, coming to the best solutions, making the best choices, often at the ballot box. It's absolutely fundamental to the system. The other thing about democracy, which John Stuart Mill in particular in On Liberty waxed lyrical about, is that this system we have and the argument and counter-argument is not just a minor choice about a system of government. It's about humankind fulfilling its potential. Whether you're talking about science, technology, making moral decisions, setting society on its course, this is the best way to do it, and it's the only way that ends up respecting the individual and the citizen. It's all a beautiful theory. John Stuart summarized it by saying, everyone should be free to do whatever they want, up to the point where the exercise of your freedom harms another. And there's the rub. How do we define harm? At what point do words hurt too much? At what point does false news, or if I use the Americanism, fake news, become a danger to the very stability of our democracy and our society? And what about abuse of, let's say, an ethnic minority? At what point does an individual or a movement saying stuff constitute incitement to racial hatred or incitement to violence and thereby legitimately be placed beyond the bounds of the law? I'm not going to speak for too long because I'm sure there'll be question and answer and we'll be discussing all of those important subsidiary questions. But I do want to say that I think it's important to make a distinction between reasoned argument and casual abuse. Reasoned and respectful argument, absolutely. The idea that there should be safe spaces anywhere, but particularly in our universities, is crazy. Safe spaces, dangerous spaces, more like. They'll cripple people's minds. Universities are supposed to be gymnasiums of the mind. And the idea that we fence off the running machine or the weights because someone gets offended by the vision of an idiot like me jogging or trying to lift weights, no, it's not on. So I suspect most of us in this tent can agree with all that. It's too easy to let the argument rest there, though. I think that we have to also take into account, given we live in the modern era, social media. And too often what we see on social media does not fall within the Voltaire or John Stuart Mill axioms about what governs free speech. Abuse is not necessarily free speech. If you pass an ethnic minority person on the street and snarl at them the N-word or the P-word, that's not argument, counter-argument, the foundation of democracy. That is just free speech. And so a lot of what we see on social media, I think, oughtn't to be covered, and I'm sure there'll be varying views about that, where we set the boundary. That's what we're here for. I'd just say that if you defend free speech, if you want to defend free speech, and I think that's probably why we're all in this tent tonight, my own view is don't be conned into thinking that you're supposed to defend people who just seek to be offensive or seek to undermine legitimate argument by being just abusive. I think I'd say free argument, yes. Free abuse, no. I want to finish then with just a left field thought. I don't know whether this is going to throw the cat amongst the pigeons or not, but I do sometimes worry, sorry for saying this, that maybe we got too much damn free speech. And I refer, going back to this, the modern phenomenon of social media and the way that so many people think that they have an absolute entitlement to be a part-time broadcaster snarling out their opinions with excessive confidence. If I were made Director General of the BBC today, or CEO of ITV, or Editor of the Times, I would immediately ban all employees saying anything whatsoever on social media, unless it was an advert for a show or a puff for the publication. And frankly, I'd do this if I were CEO of any major company. I think the idea, when you are an employee, you nowadays are an ambassador for the reputation of the organization you work for. So shut up. You've been lucky enough to get a job, your employer's giving you your daily wage, get on with the job, and if you want to argue, go down the pub with your mates afterwards. I do think, of course, if you want to stand for public office, fine, and an enlightened employer may make time for you to stand for public office, in which case you will be subject to the full gamut of argument, counter-argument, and being held to account. But the idea you can just casually broadcast, no, too much of that. So I hope that's enough meat to be getting on with. Thank you.
So I think free speech very much might be in peril under Michael's new regime. Talking of broadcasters, I'll hand straight over to a very excellent one. Andrew Doyle was a journalist at GB News.
Thank you very much. So I normally talk a lot about things like cancel culture and big tech censorship and that kind of thing. But I think in all of these debates, one of the things that we often forget about is actually historically the biggest threats to free speech have always come from the state. And I feel like given that we're at the Conservative Party conference, it might be a good time to talk about that. They say know your audience, so I'm probably going to offend some people here. But there are some problems here. We have in this country hate speech laws, which are enshrined in the Public Order Act 1986 and also the Communications Act 2003. And I don't think it's ever a good idea that any government gets to set the parameters of what acceptable thought and speech should be. But we do live in that situation. Now, if you read Paul Coleman's book, Censored, which is a very useful book because it collects together all of the hate speech legislation from across Europe, it's perfectly clear from even skimming through that in a cursory way that no government can agree on what hate speech means. Everyone has different ideas about what it means. UNESCO has pointed this out, that this cannot be meaningfully defined, so is the European Court of Justice. So it is such a nebulous term. Why? Because hate is an abstract and hopelessly subjective concept. There's the first thing to consider is, should the state or law enforcement agencies be auditing anyone's emotions? Anyway, hate is an emotion like any other, and I don't think it should be within their ambit. And what hate speech does as a concept, it's a kind of fudge, really. Because what it means is you can say, as a government, I support free speech, but I'm going to carve out some exceptions for the speech that I don't happen to like. You won't be able to define that particularly well, but you can put things on the statute books, as we currently have, for instance, with the Communications Act, where you can be arrested and prosecuted and criminalised for something you've posted online that is deemed to be, quote, grossly offensive. So that is the term that is used, grossly offensive. That's the legislation that has led to an awful lot of unpleasant people being prosecuted, deeply unpleasant people who have said deeply unpleasant things. The same legislation has been used to prosecute people for making jokes that at no point incited any kind of hatred or even had a hateful intent. And I would put it, to give you an example, there was the case of Marcus Meekin in Glasgow, who now has a criminal record for making a joke video. I would put it to you that I don't think the Scottish judiciary are best placed to judge comedy. So I think we need to consider this, because it affects all of us. Now, when you live in a free society, unpleasant people are going to say unpleasant things. That's part of it. It's human nature, right? And that's the price we pay for freedom and liberty and free speech. So when somebody says something really abhorrent, you know, just the worst, most unforgivable thing, you know, and I'd love to live in a world where that stuff wasn't said, right? But the question you should be asking isn't, do I support the right of that person to say that? The question you should be asking is, do I support the principle that the state gets to decide that those words are too much? So that's so we've got to get the question right when we talk about this stuff. A lot of people have said some awful things and been prosecuted under that law. And I think the problem is there's this very kind of, I'd say it's veering on the infantile misinterpretation. When people defend someone's right to say something, so say there's an evangelical preacher on a street corner screaming about gay people and how they're all evil and how they should all go to hell and all the rest of it. Well, if I say I defend that person's right to do that, that doesn't mean I support the idea that I should go to hell. That would be weird, right? I'm not supporting the substance of the speech, but that will be what I am accused of if I defend that person. What I am doing there is I'm saying that the principle is bigger than that individual. And if you really feel that these people who say these things are so abhorrent and ghastly, as I think we all agree they are, well, why are we giving them so much power that we are able to change the fundamental principles of our democracy because of what they do and what they say? I don't think they should have that kind of control over us. And I mention this today because I've never heard, and here particularly, and I wanted to talk about this here at the conference because I've never seen an MP stand up in Parliament and make the case for repealing the laws that we currently have that criminalise hate speech. I'd like to see someone have the guts to do that, and I haven't seen it. And I get why, because if you do that, you'll automatically be accused of supporting the hateful people. But like I say, there's a much bigger principle here at stake. I'm also very nervous that the current Conservative government has 2 bills that it's trying to push through that represent a very significant threat to our liberties and freedom of speech. The first one is the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which introduces draconian measures on protest. It puts the onus on police to decide which protests should be curbed on the basis of whether they might be too noisy, for instance, whether they might cause anxiety or cause annoyance. I think that's the phrase that's actually used. Well, protests are meant to be annoying. If someone wasn't getting annoyed, there'd be no need for the protest. And protests, by the way, are also meant to be rather noisy as well. It's not fair on the police, I should say, either, to suggest that they have to make these arbitrary decisions. But also, I just think it's clamping down on basic liberties, which I think is always going to be a problem. The other bill, of course, which is even more worrying, is the Online Safety Bill, formerly known as the Online Harms Bill. But look at the language there. Safety, harms. And the language of these documents that have been produced, I mean, effectively what they want to do is put the onus on social media companies to have a kind of duty of care to act in loco parentis over their users and to protect their psychological harm. I mean, that is explicitly said. If some words might be able to cause a psychological impact, then they should be censored. Well, that could be anything. And this kind of thing can be weaponized with ease. So I can say that one of my detractors has caused me emotional harm, psychological harm, and I can use that as a way to have them silenced. So it's a very dangerous precedent to set. The phrase that the bill actually uses is legal but harmful speech. Now just think about that, right? So what they're saying is the speech is legal, but it's caused harm in some kind of way. Now, you know the people who use these sort of phrases? They're known as critical social justice activists or the woke movement, right? So rather than having a kind of war on woke, which we often hear the Conservatives have, instead they're borrowing from their playbook. And I think that's very odd. So I think we need to stand up against that and those bills. I think we need to think about the language that is used. The phrase offensive material also gets a mention in that. And I don't think these ideas should be weaponized. Now, again and again I hear, when people talk to me about how they're being fired or attacked, what we call cancel culture, normally for very innocuous opinions, the phrase that comes up again and again is safety. And people will say, I feel unsafe. This person made me feel unsafe at work. And why does that work? Because if you go to an employer and say, I disagree with that person, they'll say, so what? If you go and say my safety has been compromised, suddenly it's a health and safety issue, and they're under a legal obligation to do something about it. It's a trick. So I don't think we should take people seriously when they talk about safety, when what they mean is they just don't like what they've heard. I don't like this. I heard it here, even here at the conference. We had this the other day. We had the Guardian political correspondent tweeting out that some trans people have said they're not going to turn up over concerns over their safety. Why? Because the LGB Alliance has a stall here, right? So, and that is, they're not talking about safety. What they mean is they disagree with the opinions expressed. And we have to be able to take a stand against this stuff because it's insidious. So I don't want to hear these phrases, this misuse of the word safety and harm and offence and hate. I don't want to hear it from students. I don't want to hear it from activists. I don't want to hear it from people trying to get their employees, colleagues fired for a difference of opinion. And I certainly don't want to hear it from the government. Thanks a lot.
Andrew, thank you so much. Moving straight over to our co-host for the evening, of course, at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and Marc Glendenning, who's their head of cultural affairs.
Yes, I'm going to follow on from Andrew's comments about hate, because I don't know about you, but everywhere I go, I'm told that hate is omnipresent. So you go on the London Underground, you see huge posters telling you to beware of hate and to report it if you see it. If you go to Scotland, you're liable to be handed a leaflet by a policeman. One of them is entitled, very charmingly, "Dear bigots, we don't want your religious hate because love lives in this country." Doesn't sound quite right, does it, in a Glaswegian accent? When the Sheffield City Council comedy Taliban banned the great Roy Chubby Brown recently from appearing at any theatre in the city, local Labour MP Jill Furness said, "There is no place for any hate-filled performance in our diverse and welcoming city. Please pass the sick bag." For the new authoritarian left, the concept of hate speech now fulfills the function that the ideas of evil, blasphemy, witchcraft, the devil used to for fundamentalist Christians. And it's the key concept that those of us in the free speech movement, which includes conservatives, classical liberals, democratic, traditional socialists, this is what we now have to deconstruct. And I've got two brief arguments I would like to put to you as to how we might be able to do that. The first is to demonstrate that hate speech is a strategic device. It's a technique of psychological propaganda designed to extend state control deep into our culture. It is the linguistic rather than the economic road to serfdom that Friedrich von Hayek wrote about in the context of fascism in the 1940s. Ultimately, the point we have to make is that new left authoritarianism is incompatible with liberal democracy, because like fascism before it, it is based on a completely different philosophical logic. The new left believe that language is a form potentially of coercive power, that it's the way in which the privileged maintain their power over the allegedly oppressed groups the new left claim exists. So if you see politics as a zero-sum struggle between mutually exclusive interests, then you can't, by definition, believe in liberal democracy, which means the right of competing narratives to fight it out in the marketplace of ideas. Take this quote from Nadia Whittome, who's a Nottingham MP. "We must not fetishize debate as though debate is itself an innocuous neutral act. The very act of debate is an effective rollback of assumed equality and a foot in the door for doubt and hatred." So you're not even allowed to doubt the particular positions. She isn't quite, of course, entitled to hold, but we're not allowed to doubt them, let alone debate them. So the logic of this is the more politically correct censorship you have, the more free your society will become, freedom through censorship. The second argument I want to put is that we need to mount a philosophically foundational case for free speech. Free speech is connected to our species' essence, to the fact that we are, by nature, creatures with agency who are able to represent our thoughts and feelings through words. So if we are to actually have real equality in the true liberal sense of the meaning, this means that all of us in this room have an equal right to call each other whatever we want to call each other. That's why I disagree with Michael's point about abuse, which we might come back to, because everybody subjectively might find something abusive and offensive and hateful that other people do not. And I would say we must assert a natural right to freedom of speech because it is connected to the very essence of being a human being. Lastly, I think we need a Free Speech Act along the lines that the Adam Smith Institute have suggested. It's the nearest we can get to a sort of First Amendment style enshrinement of this key value. But that this should be then put in a referendum to the British people. This is the only way we are going to be able to bypass the control the new left authoritarians now have over virtually every sector of our society. So to use footballing parlance, we need to go route one, we need to go straight to the people and let the people decide. I always like to end on a rabble-rousing, hate-filled note. So that's it.
Maybe take back control in that referendum, eh, Mark?
Of our vocal cords.
Yeah. Okay, and last but not least, Julie Hartley-Brewer, another fine broadcaster at talkRadio.
Thank you very much. Gosh, thank you. Before anyone gets offended by the fact that the only woman on the panel went last, I asked to go last. Someone's going to be offended by that. I'm rather in a quandary because I have very strong views on this, and yet free speech at all times, and yet I had to throw Stop Brexit Steve Bray out of an event I hosted earlier today because he was wearing a Russian army uniform. A little bit disconcerting and just wanted to talk over everybody, but that's not free speech, that's just being rude, as I pointed out to him. I mean, this is, you can't say that, is free speech in peril. You can say that. The trouble is you have to be willing to take the consequences, and we've been told, haven't we? The consequences are you get abuse on social media, in the street, you get cancelled, you lose your job, you lose your livelihood, attempts to do that even to the likes of J.K. Rowling. Well, good luck with that. I get people trying to sack me from my job every day. It's sort of kind of the sport that makes it worth getting up every morning, really, for me. I suppose a lot, and Andrew touched on this, it's who's doing the cancelling, and the censoring, sorry. Whether it is the government, certainly trying to censor us, certainly the Scottish government, as you've touched on, whether it's your employer, with diversity training and being told how you need to recognise your white privilege and your unconscious bias. All of my biases are completely conscious. Thank you very much. Whether it's the media, just basically not managing to get your viewpoint on to the telly. For instance, will you ever hear anyone on the BBC or Sky anymore ever suggesting that maybe climate change isn't a catastrophe for the planet? I know. Scary thought. But also, whether it's universities, whether it's at schools, and whether, of course, as I think a lot of us would have experienced, whether it's social media. One of my great pleasure in life is getting those Twitter reports. We have received a report about a tweet you have sent, and every single one always ends with, we have found no reason to suspend your account. And I always just retweet them with, have another go, suckers, off you go. But the biggest worry for me is actually people self-censoring. And I know, and I have to say, I hate that we're sort of rival channels, Andrew, because I think the work you have done on this issue is just second to none. And I'm so, so grateful for what you have done speaking out on this issue. And in such a... But such a measured and intellectual and ethical way. And I think that's a really big issue. I think people are self-censoring every single day. I know my colleagues in the media are. I know people in ordinary jobs are. If J.K. Rowling can get the abuse that she's had, having been much loved, national treasure for years, then lots of people just, it's not worth my while. So it depends really whether you're brave enough or whether you think you can, got enough money in the bank, you can risk it. Again, I kind of consider it a bit of a sport, but I think that I will one day be cancelled for what I say. And I walk that tightrope every single day, whether it's Ofcom or whether it's social media or whether it's just, yeah, you've just said something, or something I tweeted 10 years ago will come back to haunt me. But as Andrea and others have touched on, the question is, what is offensive? Because everything is offensive to someone these days. As you say, even something that's completely legal for you to say is now offensive and can be even considered a hate crime. And that will prompt people to call you names. So you can be an Islamophobe, a bigot, a misogynist, a transphobe, a TERF, COVID denier. I think I've been called all of those in the last week alone. But I mean, the thing is here is when people are offended, it's often like, what are they being offended by? We've got from the point where people are saying they don't like certain language about people of a different race or people of a different religion, and there's a debate to be had there. There is about what is reasonable language to use that you can find a centre ground on. But where, the debate now has moved on in recent, I would say the last year particularly, to actually people being offended by facts. People being offended by this lady's T-shirt. I own 2 of those. I have a gold one and a silver one. There's a white one. Woman, noun, adult, human, female. That is now an offensive T-shirt. Only women have cervixes. It's a fact. I had an Ofcom complaint, for God's sake, because I said to someone who was on my show, she was saying, I'm assuming I'm allowed to say she was talking about the tampon tax being rescinded, and she said, for all the people who have periods. And I said, women and girls. And she said, no, people who have periods. I went, women and girls. and she said, no, men also have periods. Don't think they do. And to which she replied, there were 2 Ofcom complaints. I had to spend time with the admin. And she replied, no, trans men have periods. And I said, that's because they're biological women. And she said, no, men do have periods. And I said, well, I said, do you know any men who've had periods? And she said, yes, I do. I said, they're lying to you, love. and I had to spend 2 bloody afternoons dealing with the admin. That I said the response should be a very simple response. If the 2 complainants can name a man who has had a period, Julia will apologise on air. Otherwise, 2-1. But that was apparently not acceptable for the admin, for the compliance department at my office. But let's see, when people are offended by facts, where do you even go? If they're trying to stop your free speech. But we are in, everyone always says it's Orwellian, but it really, really is. It is not an exaggeration to say that. So I suppose to take the second part of what we're talking about is, how do we fight back? And the way to fight back is to keep doing it. And for more and more people to do it. And everybody who isn't in peril, and lots of people say to me, well, I can fight back because I don't have an employer, or I'm retired. I can get away with saying this. Well, those people, you have a duty of care to other people who don't have the ability to fight back because they are still, trying to keep a job, and they could face trouble. And I think we have to defend everyone. We have to defend everyone, whether we like what they say, whether we like them, whether they have attacked us. You come out and you defend every single person. And there's no point saying, oh, well, those idiots were trying to shut me down. Ha, 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 I get my own back. No, we defend everybody. It's got to be a principle across the board. But fundamentally, I think everyone should adopt the response which I always have when someone tweets me and says, I'm offended by that. My response is, so what? And I really think we need to start saying, so what? And don't even engage, just carry on as you are, because we need a collective population response of, so you're offended. So what? Be offended. What the heck has that got to do with me and my right to say things, whatever you think? And if we don't fight back now, we are heading into some, I think, very, very dangerous territory where people are, we won't even know what people want to say because everyone is self-censoring so much.
I reckon there might be a few questions. Right, we're going to open up to the floor now. Have we got people on microphones? Tom, this gentleman at the back.
Hi, I've been to a couple of sessions from people who are talking about the online harms bill. And what they say is they're not trying to restrict freedom of speech, they're trying to restrict freedom of reach. So you don't have a right to reach everybody, you have a right to say what you want, we're not going to jail you, we're just going to restrict the freedom of reach. And it's about controlling conspiracy theories. And the safest way to do that is the established media who can make sure that they're the established media who are the regulated gatekeeper of information. I was wondering what the panel would have to say about that.
Does anyone want to jump in first? Yeah.
You haven't had enough of me already. The best way of dealing with conspiracy theories is to debate them and debunk them. I started on local papers in the East End of London. We had the first BNP councillor elected, and I remember desperately trying to argue with my local paper editor that we need to interview this guy. We need to talk about what he's saying, because we can totally debunk this awful man for the stupidity and the racism that he clearly expresses on a daily basis. And the same when Nick Griffin appeared on Question Time. All bad ideas are defeated by good ideas and by facts. And actually, the way to really get a conspiracy theory going around the world is not to discuss it on mainstream media.
Yeah, Andrew, go for it.
So the main problem I have with this is that it would assume that the social media companies are politically and ideologically non-partisan, which is not true. So the problem is that when you have fact checkers for Google and Facebook and the like, they're not really fact checkers. They often fact check in a particular way that supports their particular view. We'll all remember, of course, when Donald Trump was talking about that awful racist conspiracy theory that the virus might have originated in a lab in Wuhan. And now, of course, Joe Biden is looking into the possibility that the virus might have originated in a lab in Wuhan. And of course, actually, during that period, you had YouTube and Google and Facebook and all things deleting people's accounts, kicking them off social media for even entertaining the possibility. You'll also recall that when the New York Post published an article that was not very flattering towards Hunter Biden during the election campaign, you couldn't even share the link to the article on Twitter. And the New York Post, one of the biggest papers in America, founded by Alexander Hamilton, they had their Twitter account suspended until they deleted the article, which is tantamount to election interfering. So the point is, we can't trust social media companies to do the fact-checking and getting things right. And also part of free speech is you should be allowed to be wrong about things. And exactly what Julia says, we need to debunk things, because all you're doing is sending them down rabbit holes, and people will start to believe there's something in these conspiracy theories if everyone's trying to shut them up.
Yeah.
Michael.
Well, I agree with the remarks made henceforth. I suppose I should just do a very brief declaration of interest, because my company does represent some of the tech giants, though I myself am not involved in those accounts. Nevertheless, inspired by what Andrew was saying, the other point I think that bears making is to do with proportionality. There's this idea that somehow what people say is going to be policed. Most of us in this room are very, very sceptical about even that notion. But let's just entertain it for a second. Who's going to do the policing? Corporates? I thought policing was the job of the police. Okay, let's go a little further. Let's give it to the police. How much is that going to cost? What would you rather have the police chasing down? The stories that Andrew's mentioned, or serious criminals? And I do think proportionality is another feature of this, because the cancel culture mob, the way their response to everything is cancel. There's no one-day cancellation, or I'd like you to apologise, or a suggestion that maybe someone should be fined. Not that I would go down that road anyway, but it's always the death sentence, isn't it? You're cancelled. There is a complete lack of proportion on the other side in this debate, and I think you refreshed that notion in my mind, Andrew.
I was just going to read a quote, actually, in response to this, by somebody called Professor Natalie Fenton, who is a director of Hacked Off and the very left-wing Media Reform Coalition, because, of course, they have been agitating for exactly the kind of legislation this government has sadly put into place. I mean, she has said, and I find her quote very kind of sinister, she said that the vote for Brexit represented a, quote, a sinister and resentful white nationalism. It was a convenient xenophobic and often racist rhetoric that was spewed out by the three white men of Johnson, Gove, and Farage. That's bordering on racism, I think, but and we'll let that go for the time being. All too willing to feed a tabloid frenzy. The referendum experience, she argues, that to have a fully functioning democracy, there must be, quote, a source of pluralist, we'll forget that word because it's disingenuous in this context, and objective information available to all to enable citizens to make informed choices and vote accordingly. She calls for an effective regulation for a free and accountable press, by which she means a state regulator with people like her on it, and says that without this, you guessed it, hatred and intolerance can spread. This is very dangerous legislation, and this government is completely schizophrenic on freedom of speech. On the one hand, it's trying to do something to be fair to it in terms of universities, but on the other, with regards to the media and regulation of the internet, it's actually fulfilling a hard left, hacked off agenda.
From this side of the room now. This lady, the mic's coming around now.
My concern is that I know, as a fact, that if somebody is offended, they can just report it to the police and it becomes a hate crime. And that hate crime is, you are now registered, has committed a crime on the police website, police records. So you actually gain a record if somebody decides that what you have said has offended them. So I just think that people don't really realise how much of it, I know how much of it's reported and how many references each day, week to hate crime, and it's treated as a hate crime.
Great point. Anybody want to come in first?
How the hell have I not got a record?
No,
Maybe
you
you
possibly have. They haven't
They haven't
informed
told
you.
me. Oh, okay.
There's the case of Sarah Phillimore, who's a feminist lawyer, and she didn't even know she had one of these non-crime hate incident records against her name. But one of the people she had been engaging in a debate with over transgenderism said, you're a hate criminal, you now have a record. And so she got in touch with the relevant police force, who then had to confirm that she did have this record. She was never informed, let alone given the opportunity to try to contest it. Now, you couldn't meet somebody with more impeccable centre-left leaning values and views than Sarah. So it's extraordinary that she's on this database, and the police to this day refuse to take her off it.
Maybe we should all report each other. Everyone should just agree. Everyone reports 10 people, and we just totally overload the police on this one. We all report, and then when everyone's got a record, it becomes meaningless. Beat them at their own game.
Well, Sarah actually reported her cat as a test. She sent her cat's name to the Yorkshire police, and that is now, the cat now has a, seriously, this is not a joke.
But cats are hateful.
So Mittens now has a record. Michael.
Can I just observe, I mean, Julia's idea about flooding this system with complaints, okay, but we do have a Conservative government. Why is this not on the agenda for repeal? Yeah. I mean, it is the architecture of a totalitarian state.
I think a lot of people don't know the extent of the problem here. So between 2014 and 2019, there were 120,000 non-crime hate incidents recorded by police in England and Wales. That's an awful lot. That does matter, by the way, because although they don't lead to prosecution, if you go for a job and you have to have a disclosure and barring service check, you can often lose your job or not get the job that you applied for as a result of that. It's very, very sinister. Priti Patel actually did instruct the College of Policing to stop this activity, and they haven't done so. You can check their website. It's still up there, so it's still going on. So nothing's happening. And I really share Michael's point of view on this, is why is nothing being done? Why have the Scottish police got a secret database of hundreds of citizens because of the jokes they've told online? I'm not kidding. And they don't notify those people about those jokes. They're just keeping an eye on amateur comedians. This is ridiculous. We have 3,000 people a year arrested for offensive things they say online. And yes, some of those things are going to be absolutely horrible. But like I said earlier, it's the principle of the thing. My concern is that nothing much seems to be happening. And I would urge people to check what's going on here. You can check the government's own website on hate crime. You can check the Crown Prosecution Service's website on hate crime. The key point about this is they identify the protected characteristics, 5 protected characteristics, and they say that if the person perceives that either a crime or indeed a non-crime was motivated by hostility or prejudice, then it is recorded as such. And it even says quite explicitly in the Crown Prosecution Service guidelines that there is no evidence required. This is chilling stuff. It means that the police are absolutely obliged to record it in this way. And worse than this, they are described in all of the literature as victims, which completely bypasses due process. And I would say that goes back to Keir Starmer's tenure as a Director of Public Prosecutions, where he wanted to substitute complainant for victim, and that is now standard on all of this documentation, including with the College of Policing. Why is a Conservative government not doing something about this? It's a joke.
But the good thing is we can absolutely trust the police.
We can
so
trust them to
many
produce
different ways.
TikTok videos of dancing and things like that, yeah.
Where are we going next? This gentleman at the back with... Sorry. Jamie, just there, with the pink shirt.
Sir Gerald House, the former Member of Parliament for Aldershot.
Yeah.
I think that the Conservative government really does need to take a hold of this, because it is running away with us at the moment. And what Julia said about being offended, as a white, middle-aged, for I'm slightly more than that, Tory, male, Christian, I am incapable of being offended by these people. We are facing a very, very serious challenge. And there is a role for members of Parliament here, because members of Parliament can stand up and say what they believe. And if they then get prosecuted, then you have got a very serious problem in this country, and you do emphasize it. And I used to be rather outspoken. Some of my constituents objected, most agreed. And I did it in part to protect people who otherwise lose their jobs for saying the same things as I said. So, members of Parliament, if you're here tonight, you need to wake up, because we're under threat. Let's get on with it.
Yeah.
Excellent point, Cheryl.
And Marc Glendenning was a great help to me in the 1987 general election campaign.
I was
Really,
only,
so
I was
thank
only
you very
5
much.
at the time, Gerald. Very precocious.
This gentleman here.
Thank you, Brian Weller. I was just wondering, do you think the word Tory is becoming a 4-letter word and racist towards the English?
Hasn't Tory been a 4-letter word for for quite a long time?
Is
Depends how you spell it.
So is Tory an offensive word? Anyone want to?
Well, it was
No.
always intended to be, I think. I mean, it means an Irish horse thief, and it was used by the Protestant liberals and Whigs to attack those who would have been on the other side in the Civil War. So it was always intended, and it's been a bit like Millwall supporters, chant, "No one likes us, no one likes us, no one likes us, we don't care." The Tories then adopted it. Yes, it is a term of abuse, but so what? People should be free to abuse each other, I believe.
Yeah.
Isn't the same for the term Whig? I think the term
Yeah,
Whig was
so that was also
similarly
retaliation.
It was to adopt it. It's the same with the word
Yeah.
queer. You adopt the word of your detractor to describe yourself, and it disarms them. So no, I couldn't possibly see it as offensive. But like Julia was saying, anyone can be offended by anything.
I was called a Tory slapper by the by the lovely people, outside.
Well, that's very sexist.
Well, yes. I said, well, if you want me to be, But that's the thing. I'm sort of more offended by the Tory, because actually I don't have a party affiliation. I'm not nothing against you guys. I just don't have a party affiliation. But slapper, fair enough.
Michael, and then another question in a second.
I think the good news from my point of view is we've got at least 99% agreement in this room and here on the panel. But here goes the rock in the pool for the 1%, because I think if we're going to defend free speech, as we all wish, and as Sir Gerald was saying, we do have to face up to some of the knottier problems here. Now, if you let's just imagine a black child on his way to school, and he's called, the N-word. It's no problem. It's free speech. Is that what you're all saying? I don't think so. Of course you're not. That's what I'm saying. So, Mark just hang on a second. Mark just said, as an aside, it's fine to cause offence. Yes, if you're talking about, this was the point I tried to make earlier, if you're talking about argument, counter-argument, of course it's fine to cause offence. But offensive offence, one-word epithets and so on, hence the legislation, which is in a sense where perhaps where the difficulties began. But the legislation on incitement to racial hatred arose to stop that kind of poor conduct. And I think when we're all having an orgy of self-congratulation about this, we have to be careful where we draw these lines. Free speech, yes. One-word terms of abuse, intimidating children or ethnic minority communities as part of a political program by some nasty group, no. So I'm sorry if it's a sober-up moment, but that is what I think.
Can I come back?
Please, Andrew. Of course, that's why we're here.
I mean, I think Michael makes a very, very good point, is that there are some thorny, difficult issues around this topic, but the trouble is we haven't been able to have those discussions because one side of the argument is just branded as hateful, and that puts a stop to any discussions that we need to have about those kind of things. Actually, it is quite complex, and particularly with this, the issue of incitement. In America, they have the Brandenburg test. They have a very high threshold for incitement to violence. It needs to be very high. But we're not able to have this conversation. I think what underpins an awful lot of what's going on in this country and the reluctance of politicians to do anything about it is there an assumption and a misunderstanding of the power of speech. Now, speech is powerful, but seems to be now a prevalent idea that harmful jokes, off-color jokes, say, or racial slurs, or all these kind of things, that words work like incantations and they escape into society, and suddenly people get influenced in a kind of, and people just react mechanically on cues to the language that they hear. But we know that's not true. So we've had 6 decades of media effects theory research, and we know it isn't the case that public behaviour changes according to mass media consumption. It's been debunked, and yet we behave as though the programmes that people watch, the films that people watch, we have to delete that episode of Fawlty Towers, we have to take this scene out of this comedy show, because there's just this article of faith now that we're all just robots who act on cues from language. But it's not true. If we were allowed to have the debate and look at the data and look at the actual studies on this, then maybe that faith would dissipate. But we haven't been allowed to. So I think, yes, we should have the difficult discussions, but we haven't even got to that point yet.
Yeah. Can I just say, I think also it depends on the context. Now, I think people have a right, whoever they are, to walk down the street without someone coming up and shouting something at them. I think that's very different from people having a debate about the use of a word, say should black rappers be using that word repeatedly, but then banning white people from using that word. Yeah. That's an interesting debate to have. But going up to someone and shouting abuse at people, no, I mean, we're going to differ on this, and I mean, I'd love to know why you differ on this. No, I don't think people should be doing that. I mean, in the scenario of, say, someone calling me a slapper, I don't really feel the need for someone to be prosecuted for that. I would be very unhappy about any black child walking to school being called the N-word on the basis that we know what happened to children who had to endure that over the decades, and it's very, very unpleasant, and it's not the society I want to live in. But we all accept there are some, apart from you, some limits on freedom of speech. I mean, the old, shouting fire in a theatre. Why would you defend the right of someone to shout that out to somebody?
Because it is, by definition, I would argue, a self-regarding act. It's not another regarding act if you go back to John S. Mill. It's not the same as an actual physical attack. And when you concede, when you give the state the right to make these kind of judgment calls, this is not going to be applied in a fair, universal way. It's going to be applied in a very asymmetrical way. So there will be people out there shouting Tory scum, Tory slapper, what have you, and I believe they are totally entitled to do that. But of course, if other people use words that the state just so happens, or those who are in control of the state, if they will then be able to select what it is they think we should and should not be allowed to say. So you've got the incredible situation of a Scottish feminist who's on trial for having flashed up the suffragette colours during an exchange with a transgender activist. You had the extraordinary situation of somebody called Munro Bergdorf, who was appointed to the as the sort of transgender advisor to the Labour Party, who then came out with a whole lot of anti-white rhetoric saying we were all murderers and responsible for all kinds of terrible things. Now, I totally defend his right to do that, but you can't pick and choose. You know, you can say anything you want about Piers Morgan, Tories, Christians, spiders, but what you can't do is attack or even state of political positions. There's not even about offensiveness now. So I think you cross the Rubicon when you give the state that power.
Mark, you're not in favour of casual street abuse.
I'm not in favour of it, but I don't believe I have the right to ban it.
But then, Mark, isn't the issue about the misapplication as opposed to the, you know, you talked about misapplication. You know, if you put in place sort of legislation or rules where you can't go and shout abuse at somebody in the street, and you talked about misapplication, isn't then the problem with the misapplication rather than the rule itself to start with?
Well, I think that it does come back to a philosophical root, this whole debate. And the basis of the case for free speech, when the early advocates of free speech were taking on the established church, when the French philosophe and their other contemporaries, people like Thomas Paine, were taking on the state during the whole period of the European Enlightenment. Their argument was that we have agency, we are human beings, we have a quality that is completely different from other categories of animal. And the case for free speech therefore comes back to that philosophical root of the belief that human beings cannot be injured simply by hearing words. They cannot inflict injury. Once you concede that there is such a thing as psychological injury, then you're going down the proverbial slippery slope.
I do concede it, and you know, I'm of an age where I remember it. You know, the East End and the tough time that black and Asian people had. And I have to say, I found very striking, before you spoke there, when you reeled off some of your examples, you know, Tory scum and Tory slappers, it struck me, I think every example you had was in a political setting where there was, I come back to it, argument and counter-argument. And I think everyone in this tent agrees there shouldn't be restrictions on that. But there is street abuse. And if our side of the debate is going to say that doesn't matter, to abolish all the laws on that, we are not doing ourselves any favours, Mark. So I do disagree with you on this.
Strategically speaking, you might be right, but philosophically, I adhere to that hard position.
But I would say that, or Mark, just to support Mark a little bit here, is that I think free speech advocates have a real responsibility to make it clear when they disapprove of the speech they are defending, right? And what you're talking about really is the precedent. If you grant to the state the ability to shut someone up for shouting a slur on the street, it doesn't end there. It will never end there. It will go on and on and on. And of course, let's not forget that certain activists now say that their existence is being erased by people who acknowledge biological facts. So actually, the principle is bigger. You know, we all want to live in a world where people don't behave like that, but we're dealing with human beings, as I say. I think the best way to deal with it is actually through the development of the social contract, which we all, you know, we all have a kind of, you know, there are certain words I'm not going to say here because we've reached a consensus in society that certain means of expression are not acceptable in certain situations. The difference is that I should have the right as a citizen to violate that social contract should I see fit, and I have to face the consequences of that. If I shout, say, a homophobic slur on the street at someone, I'm going to be shunned, I'm going to become a pariah, I'm probably not going to get work, certainly if I tweet it out. There already are consequences in place. It's when you say, no, now you go to prison for it, that's a problem, because that will not end there, it will spread, it will be whatever people decide is offensive at that point. So I think Mark's got a point.
I'm very conscious, a lady at the back in blue is waiting patiently to ask a question to...
Thank you so much. In a way, the panel's already got onto it. I think Michael's idea about how much do we want people to be individually giving their views all the time on social media is really interesting. Obviously, we can't ban people doing that. I'm really interested in the connection between language and ideas and whether it does ever lead to violence or harm. So the concept of harm is so complex, isn't it? Who differentiates what begins to be harmful? The 3 black players in the World Cup who missed, They haven't, I don't think, sought to go into public life. You might feel some of them have, but they're footballers. Should they just have to have a thick enough skin to take all of that racist abuse online? There's a link between language and culture and ideas, isn't there? And then behaviours and conduct. Won't we have some people deterred from going into public life if we don't? So I think it's about that reach and audience is really interesting for me. So ideas that aren't meant to be seen by kids about self-harm or about anorexia or how do we control the reach of content? Who differentiates what the harm is? What's harmful? Who holds the ring on harm is at the heart of this. But obviously, clearly, such an important debate for us understanding how we relate to each other within a democracy. So thank you so much for a really rich and detailed discussion.
Well, thank you for the question. Julia first, and if we keep it quick-fire, then we can get one more in.
Okay. Oh God, the pressure. I completely understand your philosophical argument on this, but I do think, we do accept that words have meanings and words do have power. I agree with Andrew very much. I know you've written a lot about this and spoken a lot about this on podcasts and the like, about this ridiculous idea that somehow words are as bad as calling me the C word and punch me in the face are qualitatively different things, and it's absurd to claim that they're equal. But we do accept that calling people horrible names does have power, in the same way that someone saying "I love you" to you does have power. It has an effect on you. Human beings are different from animals. It does affect us. But I think there's a very big difference between society at large making a decision that we don't go around calling people the N-word or the C-word or whatever, and the tech company deciding, or having it be completely subjective, the eye of the beholder, not even the victim, in the case of non-crime police, you can't even remember what they're called.
Non-crime hate incidents.
Non-crime hate incidents. I mean, that's so ridiculous. But it can't be purely subjective. There has to be an element where, as with all laws and with all restrictions and social norms, where we as a society agree, which is why we have, jury trials that would decide, would a reasonable person think that was a crime?
I would say just very quickly, I think maybe when it comes to social media, we put the onus back onto the user. And we all make decisions about what we consume and what we don't. Actually, the block function on Twitter, for instance, enables us to screen out the people who say these ghastly things. So rather than have a paternalistic system where a group of 20-year-olds in Silicon Valley sit there and decide what you can and can't say, maybe it has to come back to us as individuals to sort of protect ourselves from speech we don't want to hear.
Very briefly, I think once you concede or you believe that words can actually have a causative effect, then you're again going in a very dangerous direction. You're basically saying human beings are not that different from attack dogs who can be triggered. None of us believe that about ourselves. Some lunatic makes a speech within my hearing telling me to do all kinds of extraordinary and terrible things. I then have the moral responsibility as to how I behave in relation to the words I've heard. So I think I come back to this very dogmatic line, but I believe we need this dogmatic line for the simple reason, not just on principle that we should have a natural right to freedom of speech, but because there is a very dangerous logic within the postmodernist theory of language that the new left, not the old left, who are very different kettle of fish, but the new left adhere to, and there is no upper limit to the degree of censorship they will visit upon this country if they have the chance. And that is why we have to hold a hard philosophical line against postmodernist theories of language.
Right, okay, last question to this lady in the front row.
Hello, I'm Kate Harris, LGB Alliance. Hooray! One thing that, just to say very quickly, it's fascinating hearing you. Whoops. It's also worrying that you're missing something, because everything that you're talking about is very clear and understood, and it's great hearing Michael and Mark and all of you talking about the limits and where we should go. But one thing you're missing is that fundamentally, at the moment, there is a lie being perpetuated across the whole of society, which is that you can change sex. And the impact on that, on us as a society, is, to me, directly leading to the danger that Julia mentioned. And I'm very, very frightened of the society in which, after thousands of years of experiencing what a man is and what a woman is, we are now challenged to say that is not true and to teach children from 5-year-olds and up that they have a gender identity that may be different from the sex they were assigned at birth. So one of the things that we're asking this Conservative government to do is deliver on 2 things. One, they said at the beginning of their term that they were going to encourage a plurality of thought across all departments. They're not at the moment because LGB Alliance is banned from discussions with most departments. And secondly, that they clarify the difference between sex and gender in every government publication. And I entreat everybody here to teach themselves the difference between sex and gender. Until you all understand that, and we all understand that, and our children all understand that, we are going backwards. And I agree with Julia, we're heading towards a totalitarian state where we have to suspend disbelief because of a minority ideology.
Kate, thank you very much. I'm being waved at by various staff members, so I've got to wrap up. We asked the question at the start, is free speech in peril? I think everybody on the panel agreed with that, but they also came up with a range of solutions. Hate, non-crime, hate incidents, tackling that, whatever it is. Saying so what? Standing up and as a movement, as a network, whatever you want to call it, saying so what to people who challenge us in this way, and then tackling the legal structures as well, as Andrew so lucidly talked about. So a wide-ranging discussion. How we fit it into an hour, I don't know, but we managed it somehow. So thank you so much to all of our panelists and for you to join us this evening.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.